Hi there, this is Michael Becker, and welcome to this episode as we dig into the personal data and identity marketplace. And we evaluate how big is it, what we need to know, and what we need to do. With me today is Lee Suker, who is the head of Authentication and Number Intelligence at Sinch. So Lee, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me.
No, thanks for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure to kind of share my thoughts with you and your audience.
Well, I'm super excited. And so with that in mind, let's just jump right in. First and foremost, can you explain to us, like, what does it mean to be the head of authentication and number intelligence, and what does Sinch do? Let's start with kind of just understanding that context, and then we'll dig into the conversation.
Okay. Well, look, I think, what Sinch does is actually fairly simple. We want to help enterprises have rich, personal and secure conversations with their consumers, customers, end users. End users have many roles to play, but essentially we want to enable rich, personal and secure conversations.
Okay. And what does that really mean within context? Like, if you think about the way an enterprise wants to engage consumers, you and I in our preamble conversation, we're talking about kind of the 3 steps that are needed for a successful relationship with the consumer. And like, how does one go about doing that?
Yeah.
So what are the 3 steps for having that successful connection with the consumer? Sure.
So from a Sinch perspective, we are a communications service provider. So through our CPaaS platform, we want to help enterprises check who end users are with confidence, without interrupting that user experience. We want to provide a personalized and contextualized ability to curate that experience. We want to enable those enterprise customers to conduct commerce safely with those end users. These are all kind of simple things, right? So, recognizing a customer, having a personalized engagement with them and allowing them to pay safely. All of those things were done in mum and pop stores 100 years ago, but doing that at scale online is super complex, and we can always do better. So, our mission at Sinch is to always make it better.
And so, like, how do we go about doing this? So maybe you can help us within context too, because to your point, on the surface, being able to say, and reiterate what I just heard you say, there's kind of 3 things to a successful online digital relationship. It's, identifying the person, so recognizing the customer. It is contextualizing and personalizing that journey. So in every step along the way, making sure that the conversation is relevant and personalized for that journey. And then finally, to your point, conducting safe commerce. And my understanding there is, essentially, from the consumer's perspective, from the enterprise's perspective, it's reducing potentials of fraud. Yeah. And from the consumer's perspective, it's reducing the potential of being hacked or interacting with somebody that actually isn't who they say they are. So, being able to have a trusted connection with the enterprise that they think they're doing business with. So basically, recognizing the consumer, so identity, personal conversation or contextualized conversation, and secure commerce. And those are the 3 steps, as I understand what you just said.
Yeah, absolutely. So I look after authentication at Sinch and number intelligence. So authentication is a key part of, recognizing the customer and allowing commerce to be conducted safely. A number intelligence can potentially personalize and contextualize the conversation. That is a complex area though, but what I'd say first of all is there are short, medium and long-term answers to some of these questions, and the long-term challenges are complex, and we don't have line of sight at Sinch from our customers of some of those. The day-to-day problems that our customers are trying to solve are, can we improve engagement by W%? Can we reduce fraud? Can we lower the cost of acquiring customers? Can we increase customer lifetime value? And all of these aspects of identity whether it's authentication or personal data, play into solving those more day-to-day problems. You might call them mundane, but they're not, because even small gains in those areas, when you aggregate them together, can lead to transformation for those organizations. So I'm very optimistic, actually, that small improvements in what we think are big problems today actually can cause quite a shift.
Yeah, and what comes to mind when you say that is, if we're implementing, let's get to the how in just a second, but so if we're sitting here and we're thinking about, we can take identity and we can take more contextualized conversations with the people we serve, and then we actually facilitate, and remove the friction from the commerce experience. If we can do that in a way that both increases revenues, reduces costs, both in the form of operational costs, but also the cost of fraud and such, you actually have fairly significant gains, right? Because you've got your revenue going up, you've got your costs and losses to fraud going down, and that gap is profit. And so there could be really very significant gains for businesses if they figure this out. So let's talk about the how a little bit. So
okay.
When we say, let's say it's Sinch is a leader in the marketplace, and so we'll use that. But let's say companies come to a company like a Sinch. What are they going to ask you for? Like, what are you going to provide them that will help them do this?
So let's drill down then on authentication just for a moment. So what we do know, and some of your other speakers, I think from MEF events, have talked about this, the role of the mobile device in authenticating end users to services is expected to grow something like 25% in compound annual growth over the next 5 years. So mobile is front and center in all of these online experiences.
So let me pause you right there, though. I mean, I think this is a really important point. So when we talk about authentication within that context, what does that really mean? Like, so for example, if I walk up to a bank or the grocery store, or let's say I'm online on my computer buying something from my computer, can you give an example of mobile's role in those three scenarios? Like getting money out of my ATM, buying something at the grocery store, or even buying something with my computer. What role does mobile play in those?
Yeah. So we've all experienced this mobile authentication, and that's SMS one-time passcodes.
Okay.
And we've probably all heard stories about insecurity, but this is predicted to be and remain the most significant mobile authentication technique for many years to come, and there are good reasons for it. It's simple to use.
Yes.
We have 5 billion trained users in SMS OTP.
Okay.
Now,
and so the idea there is, basically it's called multi-factor authentication is another term I've heard in the industry, where I'm on a website and they need to validate that it's me, and so the phone and that text message, the code that's sent to my phone, is used as a secondary means of authenticating me, and that means reduces fraud significantly.
Absolutely. So two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, essentially SMS OTP, it's a proxy to proving that an individual is in possession of the telephone number, or more precisely, the SIM card that manages that telephone number.
Right, and so that's okay. Keep going. Yeah.
So it's really useful to think about that proof of possession of the SIM card as the kind of lowest hanging fruit almost in improving security, because we're well aware that passwords, user ID and passwords on their own, very problematic, but every enterprise can simply roll out something like SMS OTP and reduce fraud.
Yes.
Reduce account takeover, lower their costs, all of those things that you just said. And I think one thing that's maybe an oversight for some enterprises, doing authentication at scale is hard, especially if you you want the highest level of security possible, you need to think about the human at the end of the day. How regular are they going to be using your authentication service? If they're using it once every 6 months, they're never going to remember the high bar process that you set. It might be super secure, but it ends up being less secure because they're pressing the reset button every time.
Yeah, I personally experience that all the time. There's certain businesses I do business with, to your point, very irregularly. And they use this third-party authentication app, which invariably gets deleted or it loses its key or whatever. And it takes me, sometimes it can take as much as 10, 20 minutes to get resynced up, if at all, which means then leads to a phone call. It's a pain.
So I use this idea, which I call R.A.I.S.E, R for regular. How regular are the end users using the service? Audience, how big is your audience? If you've got silver surfers, boomers, teens, what sort of devices do they have? How important is the service? And it's a perceived importance. It might be high value to the enterprise, but low value to the end user, and that will dictate what sort of authentication user experience they will tolerate. That's the eye. How much sway do you have? In other words, do you control the end user's device, or is it a bring your own device? To your point that you just made, if you have no control and you want an app to be downloaded, well, that's not sustainable.
Right.
And then how much expertise do those end users have? And when you think about those 5 factors, this R.A.I.S.E point, then you need, as an enterprise, to offer this consistent approach to everyone that you can manage. And that's really the value of SIM-based authentication. My view, market undervalues that. Sinch and our competitors do some great work in SMS OTP. And my role is to make incremental gains, uplift security, introduce new SIM methods that improve the user experience, find ways to lower cost. Back to the point that I raised at the start of this, our customers are trying to do perhaps mundane things like reduce fraud by 10%, right? Or reduce the cost of acquisition by a few points.
But you told me earlier in one of our conversations that we were having too, and you had a story about British Cycling on how they didn't go from 0 to 100, right? They actually applied a fairly mundane approach to becoming world champions. And I think that's a really good story of what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, these small incremental gains in a number of areas, it's when you aggregate them up that can be transformation. So British Cycling called this the aggregation of marginal gains, and they did go from being also rans to pretty much dominating the world over that period of time, and now others have caught up, sadly.
But to that point, though, I think from a leadership perspective, one of the things, a lesson that can be had from there too, is it may be perceived mundane. It's not going to always be sexy. It may be perceived to be slow, but when you give it time and patience, you can look back and say, "Well, wait a minute, we accomplished a lot." And to the extent that we actually had a very significant material gain on the overall business.
And I think it's important to be optimistic that those small gains here and there can give you, quite significant transformation.
So I guess part of it too is if you were standing in the C-suite, the message would be, "Trust me, this is all gonna play itself out, and it will be fine."
Yeah, part of that, but I'd also look at human behavior, and I would reflect on, the times we're in right now. So we're in a post-GDPR world. Okay, so we have regulatory support if end users, citizens, consumers need it. But we're also still sitting in this kind of internet surveillance business model. And on the whole, businesses are asking for more data from us, not less. So my sense is that end users themselves don't want transformational change because they don't understand it. So they're just going to use the tools that they're familiar with, certainly in the short term, until they become more confident.
Right. And again, to your point, we have 5.5 billion people worldwide that are comfortable with the security and the experience of, the simple text message. Now, I want to go back to one other point though. So I get it. And I think that's the opportunity for leadership over the next, say, 6, 10, 12 months and on is to focus on and implement these new methods and really bring in more adopted, commercial messaging solutions like text messaging into their programs. I actually really heard an interesting stat in that, I think it was something to the effect of only 6% of the world's enterprises are actually using commercial messaging like text messaging. So there's a huge growth and upside for, and with that in mind, we're doing something like 15 trillion messages with only 6% of the world's market. So there's a massive upside for both industry, but also for businesses to take advantage of this tool to be able to improve their overall relationship with their customers.
And absolutely, and I'll give you kind of another, not necessarily a stat, but a yardstick. Let's take a look at our browser history and all of the online services that we can log into. Most people are in the hundreds, potentially 200 plus, and most of those are user ID and password, which we've talked about. We know that's weak, so there's a huge amount of low-hanging fruit just to turn on SMS 2FA, for example, to improve security. But there's lots of talk about passwordless or biometrics, and my sense is that the consumers are aware on the whole of those things. I think many don't trust them, but also for most, it's just not risky enough. And they're right, because it's hard to identify 99% of all people that have had their identity stolen, right? Mm-hmm. Most people aren't at risk.
Right.
Well, they're at risk, but they won't be a victim. Most people won't be a victim is probably a better way to frame that. So they don't care. They carry on regardless. They're not going to change their behavior.
Right.
At least they're not going to take big steps to change their behavior. If I encouraged my wife to use a password manager, she would probably divorce me.
That's funny.
So, we're back to what are the very simple, unintrusive measures we can take to make a meaningful difference in security.
Well, and on that note too, I heard if we are another statistic I heard in the banking industry is somewhere around 20 to 30% of all phones into a bank's call center I forgot my password, I need help. Right. Yeah. So imagine if you actually integrated this OTP messaging capability into the conversation, you could remove or reduce a significant portion of those calls into your call center.
Yeah.
Which would be one of those incremental gains that you were just talking about. And that would leave your customer support team actually available to help with more richer service needs than just say, hey, let's work on resetting your password.
Well, I think that the high bar of security that a bank has, is not going to be the same high bar for most enterprises. But the point you make about 30% of the calls being reset my password, for a company where security is not so high, I mean, that's a disaster.
Right.
And it doesn't need to be like that. So SMS OTP can make a very meaningful difference. I have spoken to companies that have no password reset process at all, not even email. And the only option is to call the call center, which is killing them.
Sure.
And I'm sure they're not alone.
So let's talk about, so there's some very, very easy wins, and again, you're not the only one out there, but one of the answers could be call Sinch and we'll help you out and we'll help you integrate this OTP authentication into your process and have it be part of this. You also brought up one other point, and we only have a few minutes left, but you also oversee this idea of number intelligence. And I think that's an important concept also to bring into play, in that you're able to, as part of your business, essentially evaluate a phone number and kind of probabilistically guess, is this number legit, i.e. a real human being that doesn't conduct fraud on the other end, or is it not? How does that work?
So we're trying to use this to provide an extra level of assurance to authentication. So it may be that, the telephone number is not of the expected type you would have predicted for the service you are offering. It may be that the SIM card has been swapped for that device and a bank is just about to push an SMS OTP to approve a transaction.
So just pause you right there, for example. This number intelligence could say for the bank, this SIM card was changed within the last, say, 24 hours into a different device, and that device is now in a different location. So therefore, this number now has a risk profile higher than what, say, it was 48 hours ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a risk signal. It's certainly not the only signal, and a bank would not use it as the only signal.
Correct.
And fraudsters are much smarter now. 24-hour window, that's a big window. We're into hours.
Well, again, I'm just trying to generally provide an example. These risk signals is what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. You're going to have to excuse my wife is now printing.
No worries. All good. All good.
So that's the journey that we're on with number intelligence. That may lead to personalized conversations, but not yet. But what I would say to companies that are looking at Sinch is we're trying to future-proof SIM-based authentication. So SMS OTP is the lion's share today. We look to make incremental improvements on that. But don't forget phone call, because some people can't use SMS. So we have to call them, read out a PIN code. We also have data verification, which is a new service from most mobile operators. Only about 10% of MNOs are launching this. So more MNO support, please.
And what does data verification mean?
It just uses the mobile data session to verify the end user is who you think it is. The nice thing about that, no user interaction. So it removes the social engineering risk and it's faster.
What would be an example of a signal for data verification?
So it could be that, you're in a mobile app, you're logging in, and instead of using the SMS OTP as a second factor, this silently uses a data session in the background. And of course, the mobile operator knows who the data session belongs to. So we ask them, does this mobile data session belong to this number? And they say yes or no.
Right. So if that session was happening on, say, an unexpected network, or on a different type of device, or in a different unknown app, then that would raise a risk profile that then would also lead to and any questioning whether or not they should fulfill the request.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So look, we try to offer our customers all of those techniques under a single API, so that they don't need to worry about some of the complexity that underpins it. So,
and then that way, that gives them the time to focus on answering those questions. How do we reduce churn? How do we provide more value to our customers? How do we increase their lifetime value? How do we actually communicate them in a way that is of value to them at every step along their journey? Absolutely fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the opportunity and walking us through kind of where the industry is at now, where it's going, and how Sinch can help enterprises that are trying to figure this out.
That really is my pleasure, and happy to go into more details. We didn't go as deep as someone might like, and if we want to go further, I'm very happy to support you and your audience in giving more information.
Yeah, and let's definitely do it again, and we'll take it from there. Okay, well, thank you very much, Lee. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.